This week I'm asking you to read a section from a book I find really useful when it comes to the short story cycle. It's actually one of my favorite books. It's Susan Garland Mann's The Short Story Cycle. Every time I teach this course, I take this out from the library because it's a really expensive book. It's one of the reasons I don't ask you to order it as a textbook. This little book is like $80 or something. So I always take it out from the library when I teach this course. So there's a few things I want you to pay attention to as you do this reading. Feel free to skim the section that is composition and publication, where it talks a little bit about the very complicated process Hemingway went through in revising and the kind of complicated publication history that In Our Time has. Certainly you can read it if you find that interesting, but it's not that necessary. What I do want you to pay attention to in this reading, though, is the section on unity and how Hemingway created it within this cycle. The reason I say that is because you're going to want to, you're going to be writing your own three-story cycle as part of your coursework. And I'm going to be asking you to draw on some of these strategies that our writers use. So Hemingway uses some strategies. The next text we're going to be reading is Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine, and she uses some different strategies. And then Susan Minow uses other strategies in Monkeys. So you're going to be expected to draw on two different strategies in creating cohesion within your own short story cycle. So you want to be reading as a writer. You want to be paying attention to how these writers each create that sense of unity and in different ways. So that's what I want you to pay attention to. And this Mann reading is useful because Mann identifies very clearly and specifically how Hemingway does it. There's a couple of other things I want to draw your attention to. One of the repeated themes in this collection is the idea of initiation. You might have noticed that from the very first story where Nick Adams goes to the Indian camp. Nick Adams goes to the Indian camp and he is initiated into some of the more serious and grimmer aspects of adult life, even though he's a small boy. And he ends up leaving at the very end of the story. He's crossing the water and he feels like he's going to live forever, right? There's been a cathartic element to that whole scene that he's been part of, and it's almost as if he is exempting himself from that adult sphere. We as readers, though, know that what he has witnessed, albeit dramatic, very dramatic and violent episode of birth and death, is actually part of adult life. So be aware, be on the lookout for those repeated themes of initiation. So let's see what else I want to talk to you about. There's a few ways that unity is manifest in this collection. You can find it both within individual stories, elements within individual stories, and then across stories. So for example, and Mann talks about this at some length, one of the unifying elements is the presence of Nick Adams. So Nick is a protagonist in, I think, 9 of the 16 stories and 1 of the vignettes. So he's identified by name, right? And we see him from the time he is a young boy in Indian camp all the way to the end in Big Two-Hearted River, where he is an adult and he has already been initiated, right? We're seeing the aftermath, and that's another repeated element I want you to pay attention to, the sense of aftermath. We see the aftermath. We see him as someone who has come out of a trying experience, of course, World War I, as an adult. But we also have what some scholars identify as a collective protagonist. So Nick Adams is not in every single story. Instead, we have other young male protagonists. However, they so strongly resemble Nick, and obviously drawn strongly from Hemingway's own life. They so strongly resemble Nick in terms of their experience, their attitudes, and their actions that we can kind of view them and Nick Adams as a collective protagonist representative of a man of that generation. And it's, you might have noticed in, I think it's in this reading, the reading you're going to be doing, or it might be in another reading, that anyway, the generation is called the Lost Generation. And this was the generation that fought World War I and came out of it. And so, you know, World War I was such a benchmark in modern history that the men that survived it came out very disillusioned and really, I guess we would, you know, we use the term post-traumatic stress syndrome. But these men were had the very foundations of what they believed in pretty much destroyed. So we have that kind of collective protagonist that has this sort of outlook, and we see that throughout throughout the collection. Let's see. Oh, I want to talk to you a little bit about time frame. The time frame, I guess, is kind of a unifying element in that all of the stories take place either during World War I or right after. So it's right in that area. And Hemingway did not, in many cases, identify or offer specific identifying names to things. He was writing as if he assumed his reader would know that these events pertained, for example, to the Greco-Turk War or the retreat from Thrace, which is one of the vignettes, or some of the bullfighting episodes. Another unifying element is the use of imagery. So imagery is maybe not used as consistently or dramatically as in maybe other collections, but we do get repetition of imagery, and in particular, we get the juxtaposition of what we might consider opposites. So we get home versus swamp or forest. We get the juxtaposition of birth versus death, and I think that was particularly dramatized, there we go, in Indian Camp. We get the depiction of water, right, the repeated image of water, and we also get repeated images of roads and journeys. So these are almost like archetypical figures, or archetypical images, I should say. Oh, here's one thing that I do want to draw your attention to. The vignettes that occur, and those little chapters in italics that occur in between the stories. What's so interesting about that, and Mann draws this out, is that those vignettes were drawn from stories that Hemingway heard or that were told to Hemingway, or events that he observed but did not participate in. I think that speaks to the need as a writer to be someone who observes very, very closely and who listens and makes use of the material provided. So sometimes we have this idea that writers just make everything up from scratch from their own heads. And nothing could be further from the truth. We have a great example here of Hemingway drawing not just on, you know, autobiographical elements, but stories that were told to him and things that he observed, but like I said, did not directly partake in. And the vignettes, so the unifying elements I've been just talking about here and that Mann goes into in greater detail are primarily related to the stories, but the vignettes themselves have some pretty strong reoccurring themes as well, and you may have noticed that. So I would say that the three main, or I shouldn't say Mann, my friend Susan Garland Mann, identifies that the three main themes that occur and reoccur throughout the vignettes are those of war, bullfighting, and crime. And of course, these are all arenas of high violence, and you've probably noticed already that those vignettes, each little vignette is violent. It's like this little nugget of violence. So Hemingway's idea is that we were, by going back and forth between the stories and the little vignettes sandwiched in between them, that we were examining a concept in general and then going in for a close-up and then backing up and seeing something broader and then going in for a close-up. And I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. That effect is definitely there. But I also think that those little violent vignettes serve as a reminder that the violence of World War I and the aftermath were never very far away from the men that experienced them. And I say men, excuse me, because the collective protagonist in our time is male. I mean, this is, you know, it's the reoccurring protagonist is male. Excuse me while I have a sip of my tea. So I think that these little vignettes, sandwiched as they are between stories that in many cases seem almost mundane, right? Some of the stories seem on the surface to be dealing with maybe everyday things, serve as a reminder that those elements of violence were never very far removed. That what those men endured coming through World War I and its aftermath stayed with them. And so we're reminded of that, right? We're reminded of it over and over and over again. And not just the war, but also other kinds of violence, the bullfighting, and then of course there's the vignettes that deal with crime. Okay, I'm going to stop there, but please do this reading very carefully, underline ideas, and I'll be interested in your thoughts.